For over 400 years, philosophers, alchemists, and kings believed one man wrote the blueprint for the entire universe before Moses ever lived. And maybe you've felt that same pull toward a name, a guru, a book, a source that promised the wisdom no one else had access to. But Hermes Trismegistus was never one man. There wasn't a single author, and that's not the disappointing part of this story. Today, we're proving that his real power came from something far stranger than a real ancient sage. Here's how we're judging this investigation: the actual surviving Hermetic texts, the historical events that reshaped how they were read, and the scholars who dated them. Nothing vague, nothing New Age. If Hermes really was one ancient author whose authority explains why alchemy, astrology, and magic all still cite him, that should hold up against real philology. It doesn't hold up the way you think, and the crack starts with a Greek philosopher and an Egyptian god who were never supposed to be the same person. Here's the glitch. Hermes Trismegistus is a name for two completely different gods from two completely different cultures, fused into one identity centuries after both of them already had their own mythology. It's not one man writing an encyclopedia, it's an encyclopedia crediting one editor who never existed. Long before the Greeks arrived in Egypt, Thoth already held the exact job Hermes held in Greece: recorder of judgment, guide of souls between the world of the living and the dead. Same function, two names, 1,000 years apart. When Greek settlers reached Egypt, they didn't invent a new god, they recognized their own god wearing a different face. That recognition is where Hermes Trismegistus actually begins, not with a person, but a coincidence of job description. Centuries later, one European scholar would sit down with these exact texts and ask a question almost nobody else had bothered to ask. Not what do they say, but when were they actually written? Hold on to that name. It matters more than anything else in this investigation. You do this too, every single day. You trust a quote more when it's attributed to Einstein than to a stranger, even when the stranger said it. Hermes Trismegistus is the 2,000-year-old ancestor of that exact instinct, and by the end of this video, you'll never read Ancient Wisdom Says the same way again. Here's the assumption almost every documentary about Hermes leaves unquestioned: that somewhere in deep antiquity, one real sage sat down and wrote all of this himself. We're about to test that claim against the actual texts. The entire surviving Corpus Hermeticum, the supposed masterwork of the greatest sage in history, is 17 short Greek texts. Most scholars date to roughly 100 to 300 years after Christ. Not one lifetime. 2 centuries of writing credited to one name. And the handwriting, vocabulary, and even the theology shift noticeably between tractates. No single author writes with a completely different voice about completely different topics across 200 years. That's not a biography, that's a filing cabinet. No papyrus, no inscription, no historical record anywhere names a real individual person as Hermes Trismegistus. Every serious historian of the Hermetica, Copenhagen, Thoudon, agrees on this. The name was never a biography. It was always a signature applied after the fact. But wait, if there was no real author, how did anyone ever believe there was one? The answer isn't a mistake, it's a system, and it starts with a god the Greeks didn't invent, they borrowed. 1,000 years before a single Greek Hermetic tractate existed, Egyptian temple inscriptions already called Thoth the inventor of writing, the recorder of judgment, the scribe of the gods. The Greeks weren't inventing an authority, they were annexing one that already had a 1,000-year head start. We saw this same move when we traced the halls of Amenti back to a single 1925 channeler. an entire tradition of ancient wisdom that turned out to have one identifiable, much more recent source event underneath it. Hermes runs the opposite direction, real ancient roots, but no single real author on top of them. Two different mechanisms, the same underlying lesson. Trace the authority back far enough, and it never ends where the myth says it does. Assumption 1 is dead. There was no single ancient author. But that raises a bigger problem. If there's no author, was there at least an ancient Egyptian text underneath the name? That's assumption 2, and it's about to fall just as hard. Assumption 2. If Hermes is fundamentally Egyptian, then his texts must be genuinely verifiably ancient Egyptian wisdom. Let's check the actual paper trail. The Emerald Tablet, the single most famous line ever credited to Hermes, as above, so below, has no surviving ancient Egyptian original. Its earliest known text is Arabic, from roughly the 8th or 9th century, over 1,000 years after Egypt's Hermetic tradition supposedly began. Here's a genuine fork scholars still argue over. Some, like Garth Fowden, think the Greek Hermetica are translating real, sophisticated Egyptian priestly theology that was already philosophically advanced. Others think the Egyptian coding is decoration on what is fundamentally new Hellenistic philosophy wearing a costume. Both sides have read the same fragments. Drop your answer in the comments and tell me which evidence you find stronger, because I've genuinely gone back and forth on this one. Clement of Alexandria describes 42 essential sacred books credited to Hermes. What actually survived is 17. The myth is the burned library. The evidence is the shelf that's left. The ancient Egyptian text and the text we actually have are not the same age. Assumption 2 is dead too, which leaves the biggest one standing. Assumption 3, the biggest one, that Hermes' authority came from the wisdom itself being self-evidently true. But watch what actually happened to any text stamped with his name, regardless of what was inside it. Across medieval Islamic and Latin Europe, writing Hermes on your alchemical or astrological text worked the same way slapping "as seen on Shark Tank" works today. The label sold the content before a single reader checked whether it was true. Scholars have a name for this: Hermetic pseudepigraphy. But does that mean the wisdom itself never mattered? Not exactly. It means the name was doing work the content alone couldn't do, and that distinction changes everything about how this authority actually functioned. Even the founding vision text, the Poimandres, doesn't claim Hermes invented this wisdom. It shows him receiving it from a divine mind and being told to pass it on. The text builds him as a conduit, not an originator. All three assumptions are gone. No real author, no purely ancient text, no authority earned by content alone. So what's actually left standing? That's where this gets strange. So here's where it looks solved. Hermes Trismegistus was a literary fiction, a composite name stitched onto centuries of other people's writing. Case closed. Except that answer leaves the most important part of the mystery completely unexplained. Remember that scholar from earlier? In 1614, Isaac Casaubon did exactly what we just did, checked the actual Greek against known dates, and proved the Hermetic texts were written centuries after Plato, not before Moses. The myth got publicly, definitively debunked 400 years ago. So here's the problem nobody explains. If the myth was debunked in 1614, why did the Hermetic influence on alchemy, astrology, and Western esotericism keep growing for the next 400 years? A busted myth should die. This one didn't. Here's what it costs to keep going. You have to let go of the idea that ancient automatically means true, and that a prestigious name automatically means trustworthy. That's not just about Hermes, that's about every studies show, every misattributed quote, every source you've trusted because of who it was attached to, not what it actually said. That's a real belief to release. Sit with it for a second. Here's where the shadow thread and the destabilized question finally meet. The reason the myth survived its own debunking isn't a mystery. It's the exact mechanism the authority ran on the whole time, and it was never Hermes' historicity. Watch what the name itself was actually doing this whole time, independent of whether a real Hermes ever existed. A name can function as a trust transfer mechanism. It moves credibility from itself onto whatever it's attached to, whether or not the name refers to anyone real at all. Say that back to yourself, because it's the whole answer. Earlier, I promised we'd prove that Hermes' absolute authority came from something stranger than a real ancient sage. Here is the proof. The 1614 dating scandal is like carbon dating a medieval sword and discovering it was forged last year. The object itself is still real, still functional, still capable of cutting, but the age story built around it collapses instantly. Casaubon's discovery should have killed Hermetic authority overnight. It didn't, because that authority was never resting on the text's real age. It was resting on the name's power to transfer trust onto anything it touched. A mechanism that works exactly as well on a text everyone knows is late as it does on one everyone believes is ancient. That's the blind spot variable. Nobody calculated it because nobody thought to ask what the myth was actually made of underneath the antiquity claim. That's why the myth survived being debunked. It was never a claim about history that could be falsified. It was a trust delivery system that kept working the moment people stopped checking, which is a far more useful thing to understand than one wise old man wrote it all. And this is where the ancient text says something that should stop you cold about why this mechanism never went away. It just changed clothes. But here's why that matters mechanically, because the numbers tell a very different story than ancient mystery. Hermes Trismegistus was the first verified brand in intellectual history. Before verified checkmarks, before peer review, before citation counts, there was a name that made anything it touched sound trustworthy on contact. Hermes was version 1 of a system we're all still living inside. Watch this happen in real time, because you've seen it today, and you'll see it again tonight. Every time you trust a product more because it's as seen on a famous show, or trust a quote more because a famous name is attached, you're running the exact same mechanism Egyptian priests and Renaissance philosophers ran with the name Hermes. The label sells the content before anyone reads it. It's not a flaw in you, it's a 2,000-year-old feature of how human trust actually works, and now you can see it operating in real time every day. Which means once you can see the mechanism, you can build a filter for it. Here's how. 3 questions. That's the entire hack. Let's walk through them. Question 1. Does this claim survive if you remove the famous name attached to it? If the wisdom collapses without the label was doing all the work. Question 2. Can you trace this claim to its actual origin, or does it just say ancient and stop there? Real sources are checkable. Vague antiquity is a hiding place. Question 3. Would you find this claim convincing from an anonymous source? If not, you're not evaluating the wisdom, you're evaluating the name. Exactly like every reader of Hermes for the last 2,000 years. And this is how that proof changes what you do on Monday morning, not by making you cynical about every ancient text, but by making you notice every single time when a name is doing the persuading instead of the evidence. Run those 3 questions on the next Ancient Wisdom post, the next Miracle Supplement testimonial, the next viral quote card you see today. Most of what you're persuaded by will fail all 3. That's not depressing. That's the first real power you've had over this mechanism since it was invented. You're not defenseless against it anymore. You just have to remember to ask. Here's the second genuine fork. Now that you know the name was manufactured trust, does that make the actual philosophy in the Corpus Hermeticum less valuable, or does it finally let you judge that philosophy on its own terms for the first time in 2,000 years? I don't think there's an obviously correct answer. Drop yours in the comments. Which way do you land? This channel keeps circling one question we never fully answer. Can principles like these be actually lived or only understood? Knowing the name was manufactured doesn't resolve that. It just strips away one more excuse for staying only in your head. So after all that, who was Hermes, really? It's time for the verdict. 2,000 years of philosophers, kings, and alchemists asked the wrong question about this man. Here's the right one. Hermes Trismegistus is not the man who wrote the universe. He never existed as one person, and the actual surviving text he's credited with is 17 tractates written across 2 centuries by unknown hands. What he is the name Western civilization built to make its own accumulated wisdom sound like it had one author, and that name worked so well it survived its own public debunking by 400 years. That's not a smaller story than Ancient Sage. That's a bigger one. Here's the door we didn't open tonight. Hermes got his Casaubon 400 years late. What other ancient authority in your own belief system never got one? Mastering the tripartite mindset of Hermes is the ultimate goal, but you will never achieve it if you're stuck in a relentless 24/7 hustle cycle. Click the video on the screen to see why the grind set mathematically guarantees failure. But hey, that's just a theory, a Hermetic theory. Thanks for watching.